I came home to find my wife on the kitchen floor with her arm twisted in half. The bastards who did this were wearing fake HOA officer uniforms, claiming she'd violated community standards by asking too many questions about where our neighborhood fees were going. They snapped Emma's arm like it was nothing, a warning to keep her mouth shut about the financial investigation. But here's what those fake officers didn't know about me. I've got biker cousins who don't take kindly to people hurting family. And when I made that phone call, everything in our quiet suburban neighborhood was about to change forever. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started. My wife Emma runs this legal blog that's gotten pretty popular over the years. We're talking about 500,000 followers who hang on her every word about consumer rights and legal corruption. She's got this background as a former prosecutor, so when she smells something fishy, she doesn't let it go. That's exactly what happened when our HOA fees suddenly jumped 400% over 2 years. 400%. Can you imagine opening that bill and seeing your monthly payment go from $200 to $800 with barely any explanation? I mean, what kind of landscaping improvements could possibly justify that kind of increase? Emma started getting flooded with messages from our neighbors, and let me tell you, people were not happy about these insane fee hikes. Everyone in our neighborhood was freaking out about these sudden financial burdens, but nobody could get straight answers from Diane Blackwood, our HOA president. Now, Diane always presented herself as this perfect suburban widow. You know the type. Always dressed to the nines, organizing charity events and making sure everyone's lawns were trimmed to exactly the right height. She had this way of making you feel like questioning her decisions was somehow unpatriotic or disrespectful to community values. But Emma's not the type to be intimidated by someone's social status or their carefully cultivated image of respectability. She started digging into the HOA's financial records, and that's when I got involved. See, I'm a construction engineer, so when Emma showed me the paperwork for our Memorial Rose Garden, I knew something was seriously wrong. According to the invoices, this garden cost $3.8 million for advanced landscaping work, $3.8 million for what was essentially some flower beds and a basic sprinkler system that any competent homeowner could install for maybe $10,000. The math just didn't add up. And when I tried to reconcile the actual work performed with the money supposedly spent, the discrepancies were staggering. That's when Emma's investigative instincts really kicked into high gear. She published this blog post titled, "Where Did $3.8 Million Go?" And within 24 hours, it had gone viral with over 200,000 views. The comments section exploded with people sharing their own HOA horror stories from across the country. It was like Emma had struck oil, except instead of black gold, she'd hit a vein of suburban corruption that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. Readers were sharing stories about mysterious construction projects, inflated maintenance contracts, and HOA presidents who seemed to live far beyond their apparent means. That's when Diane Blackwood started showing her true colors. Instead of welcoming transparency or offering reasonable explanations for the discrepancies, she went straight into attack mode. First came the expensive lawyer with the cease and desist letter claiming Emma was committing defamation by asking legitimate questions about public financial records. But Emma's prosecutorial background kicked in immediately. She knew that legitimate organizations don't threaten lawsuits when residents ask reasonable questions about where their mandatory fees are being spent. So, Emma did what any good investigator would do. She dug deeper. She started tracing shell companies following paper trails and connecting dots that Diane probably thought were safely buried under layers of bureaucratic complexity. Emma discovered multiple business entities with confusing names like Meadowbrook Community Enhancement Solutions and Suburban Infrastructure Development Associates, all somehow connected to HOA expenditures that made absolutely no sense when you looked at the actual work performed. The more she investigated, the more suspicious everything became, and the more desperate Diane's attempts to see you shut down the investigation grew. Then the harassment started in earnest. Anonymous letters showed up in our mailbox claiming Emma was going to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service for unreported blog income. Fake legal documents appeared on our doorstep, threatening all kinds of frivolous lawsuits designed to drain our savings through legal fees. Someone even sent poison pen letters to Emma's blog sponsors trying to get her advertising revenue cut off by claiming she was spreading false information about respected community leaders. But instead of backing down, Emma saw all this intimidation as proof that she was onto something genuinely big. When Emma announced she was launching a comprehensive investigation into HOA financial transparency and promised to publish her findings regardless of legal threats, I could see the fear in Diane's eyes at the next board meeting. This wasn't just some neighborhood blogger with a few hundred followers anymore. Emma had serious reach, serious legal knowledge, and now she had a mission that was resonating with hundreds of thousands of people who had experienced similar corruption in their own communities. She was getting tips from forensic accountants, advice from federal investigators who specialized in municipal corruption, and support from an army of followers who wanted to see justice served. Looking back now, I realized that was the exact moment Diane made her fatal decision. Legal intimidation wasn't working because Emma knew too much about the law to be scared by fake threats. Social pressure wasn't working because Emma's audience was growing stronger every day. Economic pressure wasn't working because Emma's blog was actually generating more revenue as the controversy grew. Diane had tried every conventional method of silencing critics, and nothing was slowing Emma down. So, she decided to try something much more direct, much more personal, and infinitely more dangerous than anything she'd attempted before. The signs were all there, if we'd known how to read them. Diane's behavior at community meetings became increasingly erratic and defensive. Her explanations for financial decisions became more convoluted and harder to follow. She started surrounding herself with unfamiliar people who didn't seem to have any official connection to HOA business, but were always present when controversial topics came up. Most telling of all, she began making veiled references to troublemakers who needed to learn that actions have consequences, and community harmony required everyone to know their place. But we were focused on the financial investigation and didn't recognize these warnings for what they really were: the desperate threats of someone who had already crossed lines that most people would never even consider approaching. Diane Blackwood wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She was someone who'd gone to extreme lengths to protect her secrets, and she was ready to do whatever it took to keep them hidden. What was buried in that garden that Diane would eliminate people to protect? The mornings everything changed started like any other Tuesday in our quiet suburban neighborhood. Emma was at her home office working on her latest blog post about HOA accountability when someone knocked on our front door around 10:30 in the morning. Through the security camera, we could see this official-looking guy in what appeared to be some kind of municipal uniform, carrying a clipboard and wearing a badge that looked legitimate from a distance. He had the whole professional government worker appearance down perfectly, the kind of inspector or code enforcement officer you might expect to see in any American suburb. Emma went to answer the door, while I was in the garage working on my truck, completely unaware that our lives were about to change forever. This guy, who we later learned was named Max Steele, had somehow gotten inside our house and was claiming to be a senior HOA enforcement officer with authority to investigate violations of community standards. He had fake credentials that looked incredibly professional, complete with an official-looking badge, laminated identification cards, and documentation, claiming Emma had violated community harmony regulations with her blog posts about HOA financial irregularities. At first, Emma tried to handle the situation like the experienced lawyer she used to be. She asked to see his supervisor's contact information, demanded to know what specific regulations she'd supposedly violated, and questioned his legal authority to be inside our home without a warrant or our explicit consent. She even asked to photograph his credentials so she could verify them with the appropriate municipal authorities. But Max wasn't there for a reasonable discussion or legitimate government business. He was there to send a very specific message, and that message was going to be delivered whether Emma cooperated or not. I'll never forget the sound Emma made when he grabbed her arm. It wasn't a scream exactly. It was this shocked, breathless gasp of someone who suddenly realizes they're in genuine physical danger. The sound cut through the noise of my power tools and made my blood run cold with that primal recognition that something terrible was happening to someone I loved. By the time I dropped everything and ran into the house, Max had deliberately twisted Emma's arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly how to cause maximum damage. The sound of bones breaking was like a branch snapping, and Emma's face went white with shock and agony. "Next time you get a warning from the HOA," Max said in this cold professional voice that somehow made his words even more terrifying. "You better listen. We have ways of dealing with troublemakers who won't cooperate with community standards." Then he just walked out of our house like nothing had happened, leaving Emma collapsed on our kitchen floor, with her arm bent at an unnatural angle that made my stomach turn. In his hurry to leave the scene, he dropped his fake badge on our floor, which gave me my first concrete clue that none of this had been legitimate government business. The ride to the emergency room felt like it took forever, even though the hospital was only 15 minutes away. Emma was barely conscious, going into shock from the pain and the trauma of being attacked in her own home by someone pretending to represent official authority. But even through her agony, her prosecutorial mind was still working, still putting pieces together. "This wasn't random, Dave," she managed to whisper through gritted teeth. "Someone specifically wanted to cripple me to stop the investigation. This was a professional job designed to send a message." The emergency room doctor took one look at Emma's x-rays and confirmed what I already suspected in my heart. "This was deliberate assault, designed to cause maximum damage," he told me quietly while Emma was getting her arm set in the casting room. "Whoever did this knew exactly how to break bones for maximum pain and longest possible recovery time. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated torture." The cast went from her wrist all the way up past her elbow, and the doctor explained that it would be months before she could use that arm normally again, if ever. Filing the police report felt like an exercise in frustration. The responding officer was professional and sympathetic, but without more concrete evidence connecting the attack to specific individuals, there wasn't much the legal system could do to help us. Max Steele had vanished without a trace, and his fake credentials were sophisticated enough that someone had invested serious money in creating them. Without being able to connect this perpetrator to whoever hired him, the officer explained apologetically, "We're looking at a random assault case with minimal physical evidence and no viable suspects." But I knew this wasn't random, and I was beginning to understand that the police weren't going to be able to provide the kind of protection Emma needed. Diane Blackwood had escalated this situation to a level where normal legal channels weren't adequate to ensure our safety. Emma was lying in that hospital bed with her arm in a cast because someone had sent a professional enforcer to hurt her as a warning. What would they do next if she didn't back down from her investigation? How far were they willing to go to protect whatever secrets they were hiding? That's when I stepped out into the hospital corridor and made the phone call that would change everything about our situation. I dialed my cousin Tommy's number, and when he answered, I could hear classic rock music and motorcycle engines rumbling in the background. "Tank," I said, using the road name he'd earned during his years with the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. "Someone hurt Emma bad. They sent fake HOA officers to break her arm. I need help that badges and courts can't provide." The music stopped immediately, and I could hear Tommy shouting orders to his club members in the background. His voice went ice cold in a way I hadn't heard since we were kids dealing with neighborhood bullies who thought they could push our family around. "Say no more, little cousin," Tommy said with deadly certainty. "Nobody touches our family. Nobody gets away with hurting people we care about. We're rolling out right now." Then I heard the sound of multiple motorcycle engines starting up, and the unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidson motorcycles hitting the road at high speed. 20 minutes later, 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roared into the hospital parking lot with enough noise to wake the dead. Patient staff and visitors stopped what they were doing to stare as leather-clad bikers marched through the corridors like they owned the place. But these weren't just any bikers. These were my family, my blood relatives who'd dropped everything and ridden across town because someone had made the fatal mistake of thinking they could hurt Emma without facing consequences. Tommy "Tank" Rodriguez is 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and scars a former detective who'd left the police force under circumstances that nobody talks about but everyone respects. When he walked into Emma's hospital room and saw her lying there with her arm in a cast, his jaw clenched in a way that told me someone was going to pay dearly for what they'd done. He examined the fake badge that Max had dropped, turning it over in his hands, with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of forged documents during his law enforcement career. "Whoever did this," Tommy said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of dealing with dangerous people, "picked the wrong family to mess with. Would these bikers really go to war over a broken arm? Or was there something darker Tommy was about to discover? If you're watching from your hometown, drop a comment and let BD Stories know where you're from. Curious to see how far this incredible story reaches, watching 12 Harley-Davidson motorcycles roll into a hospital parking lot is something you don't forget. The sound alone, that deep rumbling thunder of American steel and chrome, was enough to make every head turn and every conversation stop. But seeing Tommy "Tank" Rodriguez stride through those hospital corridors was something else entirely. At 6'4" and 250 pounds of pure muscle and determination, Tommy commanded respect just by walking into a room. When Tommy saw Emma lying in that hospital bed with her arm in a cast, something shifted in his expression. This wasn't just anger. This was the cold, calculated fury of a man who'd spent years as a detective before life pushed him in a different direction. "Whoever did this picked the wrong family to mess with," he said quietly, and I knew he meant every word. Tommy examined the fake badge that Max had dropped, turning it over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of forgeries during his law enforcement days. "This wasn't random street crime, Dave," Tommy continued. "Someone hired a professional muscle to hurt Emma. That means we're dealing with something bigger than just an angry HOA president." He looked at Emma with genuine concern. "You must have gotten close to something that scared them badly enough to risk this kind of escalation." Emma managed a weak smile and said, "I guess my investigation really hit a nerve." But I could see the determination in her eyes, even through the pain medication. That's when Tommy introduced us to Rico Blade Rodriguez, my younger cousin, who'd just walked into the room. Rico looked nothing like what you'd expect from a biker, clean-cut, quiet, more comfortable with computers than motorcycles. But Tommy explained that Rico was their secret weapon, a former computer analyst with some serious technical skills, who'd joined the Iron Wolves after his government career ended abruptly. "Rico's going to help us figure out exactly who we're dealing with," Tommy said. Within an hour, Rico had worked some kind of magic with the hospital's security system. He pulled up crystal-clear footage of Max Steele from multiple camera angles, showing everything from his arrival to his hasty departure after attacking Emma. "Facial recognition software is a beautiful thing when you know how to use it," Rico said with a slight grin. "Meet Max Steele, former military contractor, with a history of enforcement work for people who prefer to stay anonymous." But that wasn't the most shocking discovery. Rico had also traced the rental car Max used, tracked his fake identification purchases, and followed a digital paper trail that led directly to some very interesting financial transactions. Someone paid this guy $25,000 through a series of cryptocurrency transfers, Rico explained. And those transfers originated from accounts controlled by one Diane Blackwood. The room went dead silent. Tommy's expression darkened as the implications sank in. "So, our perfect suburban HOA president hired a professional enforcer to break Emma's arm." But Rico wasn't finished. "That's not all," he said, pulling up more data on his laptop. "I dug deeper into Diane's financial records, and there's a pattern here. Large suspicious payments around the time that journalist Kevin Walsh disappeared 18 months ago." My blood ran cold. Kevin Walsh, the guy who was investigating HOA corruption. Rico nodded grimly. His final cell phone ping was at Diane's property the night he vanished. And look at this. I recovered his final article draft from Cloud Backup. It was titled HOA Corruption, the Suburban Money Laundering Scheme, and it specifically mentioned Meadowbrook financial irregularities. Tommy stood up slowly, his face grim with understanding. "She didn't just steal money from the community," he said quietly. "She eliminated the journalist who was going to expose her, and now she's trying to eliminate Emma for getting too close to the truth." The weight of that realization settled over all of us like a dark cloud. This wasn't just about embezzlement anymore. We were dealing with someone who had gone to great lengths to protect her secrets. "I'm calling a full club meeting," Tommy announced. "This isn't just about protecting Emma anymore. This is about getting justice for Kevin Walsh and making sure Diane Blackwood can never hurt anyone else." He looked at me seriously. "Dave, you need to understand what you're asking for here. Once the Iron Wolves commit to something like this, we see it through to the end. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at Emma lying in that hospital bed, her arm in a cast, because someone wanted to silence her investigation into community corruption. I thought about Kevin Walsh, a journalist who died trying to expose the truth. And I thought about all the families in our neighborhood who'd been unknowingly funding Diane's crimes through inflated HOA fees. Whatever it takes, Tommy, she can't be allowed to get away with this. Within hours, Tommy had assembled the full Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club chapter. These weren't just weekend riders. These were serious men who'd made a commitment to protect their community and their family. When Tommy explained the situation and showed them Rico's evidence, the vote was unanimous, full support for the Rodriguez family and full commitment to exposing Diane Blackwood's crimes. The strategy was simple but effective intelligence gathering, combined with psychological pressure. The goal wasn't just revenge. It was justice for Kevin Walsh and protection for anyone else who might threaten Diane's secret empire. "We're not just getting revenge," Tommy told his assembled club members. "We're making sure a killer can never hurt anyone else." As the first phase of their plan went into effect, Tommy's bikers began taking shifts outside Diane's mansion. Not breaking any laws, not making threats, just maintaining a visible presence that sent a clear message. We're watching you, and we know what you did. Within hours, Diane was looking over her shoulder constantly, and her perfect suburban composure was beginning to crack. How many people had Diane already silenced to keep her secret safe? If you've never seen a grown woman slowly lose her mind from paranoia, let me tell you, it's both fascinating and terrifying to watch. Within 24 hours of Tommy's bikers beginning their surveillance, Diane Blackwood went from perfectly composed HOA president to a nervous wreck who couldn't leave her house without looking over her shoulder. And the beautiful thing was, they weren't doing anything illegal. They were just there watching her, with those cold, knowing stares that said, "We know exactly what you did." The Iron Wolves had this rotation system down to a science. There would always be at least 2 motorcycles parked somewhere within sight of Diane's mansion, never blocking traffic or causing problems, just maintaining that constant visible presence. When Diane went to the grocery store, bikers followed at a respectful distance. When she attended her charity committee meetings, motorcycles would be in the parking lot when she came out. When she visited her lawyer's office, leather-clad figures would be leaning against their bikes across the street, arms crossed, just watching. But Rico was running a much more sophisticated operation behind the scenes. Using his technical skills, he'd managed to hack into Diane's smart home system through some manufacturer backdoors that most people don't even know exist. The psychological warfare he launched was subtle but devastating. Lights would flicker at 3 in the morning. Her television would randomly turn on to missing persons documentaries. Her smart speaker would occasionally play audio clips that Rico had recovered from Kevin Walsh's phone, the journalist's voice asking questions about municipal corruption. Each incident was designed to make Diane question her own sanity and security. Was someone in her house? Were her electronics malfunctioning? Or was the ghost of Kevin Walsh somehow reaching out from beyond the grave? Rico would watch her through her own security cameras as she wandered around her mansion at night, checking locks, peering out windows, and gradually losing the composure that had made her such an effective community leader. The breaking point came when Max Steele tried to push back against the bikers. Apparently, Diane had called him in a panic, demanding that he handle the motorcycle problem the same way he'd handled Emma. But Max quickly learned that intimidating a single woman in her home was very different from taking on the Iron Wolves motorcycle club. When he approached a lone biker at a gas station, thinking he could throw his weight around, 20 Iron Wolves members materialized from seemingly nowhere within minutes. Tommy's voice was calm but deadly serious as he addressed Max directly. "You broke our family member's arm. We don't forget things like that, and we sure don't forgive them." Max took one look at the circle of leather-clad bikers surrounding him and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He retreated to his vehicle and immediately called Diane to report that these aren't ordinary bikers. They're organized, they're disciplined, and they know things they shouldn't know. Meanwhile, Emma was recovering at home, but refusing to stay quiet. Even with her arm in a cast, she was using voice-to-text software to continue publishing blog posts, and her audience was growing exponentially as word spread about her investigation and the attack she'd suffered. "I want that woman to pay for what she did to me," Emma told me one afternoon, as we watched the bikers maintain their surveillance from our living room window. When I suggested that Tommy was handling it, Emma shook her head firmly. "Not enough, Dave. I want her completely destroyed." Rico's masterstroke came when he arranged for a water pipe break near the Memorial Rose Garden through his contacts in the city maintenance department. When the construction crew showed up and started preparing to excavate for repairs, Diane raced to the scene like her life depended on it. She personally supervised every shovel of dirt, claiming that certain sections of the garden were structurally sensitive and couldn't be disturbed without proper permits and environmental studies. The entire neighborhood watched this performance with growing suspicion. Here was their HOA president, supposedly a pillar of the community, acting paranoid and defensive about routine maintenance work in a public garden. People started asking questions. Why was Diane so nervous about some flower beds? What could possibly be structurally sensitive about landscaping that the community had paid millions of dollars to install? The social isolation that followed was perhaps more effective than any direct confrontation could have been. Neighbors who had once respected Diane as a community leader started whispering among themselves. HOA board members began asking uncomfortable questions about financial records that Diane couldn't satisfactorily explain. The perfect suburban facade that she'd worked so hard to maintain was cracking under the pressure of constant scrutiny. But Diane was far from finished. As the pressure mounted and her options dwindled, she began planning something desperate. Late at night, when she thought no one was watching, she made phone calls from burner phones to numbers that Rico was monitoring. She was exploring her final options, and those options were getting increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. The paranoia was eating her alive. She'd installed additional security cameras, hired private security guards, and even considered fleeing the state entirely, but she knew that running would be an admission of guilt, and there was too much evidence buried in that garden for her to simply abandon everything and start over somewhere else. She was trapped, and she knew it. Rico's surveillance network had grown beyond just watching Diane. He was monitoring her communications, tracking her financial transactions, and building a comprehensive picture of her criminal enterprise. What they discovered was even worse than they'd initially suspected. Diane hadn't just embezzled money and killed Kevin Walsh. She'd been running a sophisticated operation that had victimized dozens of communities across multiple states. The psychological pressure campaign was working perfectly, but it was also pushing Diane toward increasingly desperate measures. Tommy knew that cornered animals were the most dangerous, and Diane Blackwood was definitely feeling cornered. The question was, what would she do when she realized that all her legal and financial tricks had failed, and the truth was closing in around her like a noose, as sleep deprivation and paranoia took their toll? Diane made the fatal mistake that Tommy had been waiting for. In a moment of desperation and poor judgment, she called Max Steele with instructions that would ultimately seal her fate. "Meet me at the garden at midnight," she whispered into her burner phone, not knowing that Rico was listening to every word. "We need to move him before they find him." Was Diane walking into Tommy's trap, or was she about to eliminate the last person who could expose her? Anyone else getting chills right now? What Diane didn't know about Max Steele was that he had a very strict personal policy about job security. See, when you're in the enforcement business, trust is a luxury you can't afford, and loyalty is something that needs to be constantly verified. So, Max had developed this habit of recording every interaction with his clients, not out of paranoia, but out of pure professional survival instinct. Insurance, he called it. And that insurance policy was about to pay off in ways he never expected. Rico discovered Max's recording system through some electronic surveillance that I probably shouldn't ask too many questions about. Turns out Max had crystal clear audio and video of Diane ordering Emma's attack, complete with specific instructions about how much damage to inflict and what message to send. But more importantly, he had recordings of Diane's panicked phone calls after the attack, including one particularly damning conversation where she'd confessed to eliminating that journalist before he could destroy everything I built. When Tommy decided to approach Max directly, it wasn't with threats or violence, it was with information. They met at a diner outside of town, just two professionals having a conversation about mutual interests. Tommy slid a tablet across the table, showing Max exactly what Rico had discovered about Diane's long-term plans. "She's already planning your elimination," Tommy explained calmly. "It's standard operating procedure for people like her. No loose ends, no witnesses, no complexions." Max studied the evidence with the cold professionalism of someone who'd been in this business long enough to recognize patterns. The financial records showed payments to other enforcement specialists who'd worked for Diane in the past, followed by mysterious accidents or disappearances within months of completing their jobs. The message was clear: Diane Blackwood didn't believe in retirement plans for her hired help. "What do you want?" Max asked, though I think he already knew the answer. Tommy's proposal was simple and straightforward. "Work with us instead of against us. Provide the evidence you've collected, help us expose what she's done, and we'll make sure you live long enough to spend that money she paid you." It wasn't really a negotiation. It was a life insurance policy disguised as a business deal. The decision didn't take long. Max had always known that his line of work came with certain occupational hazards, but he'd never planned on being betrayed by his own clients. Self-preservation kicked in, and within hours he was providing Rico with everything: audio recordings of Diane ordering Emma's attack, video footage of their meetings, digital copies of payment receipts, and most damaging of all, recordings of Diane's confession about Kevin Walsh. The smoking gun was a conversation recorded just days after Emma's attack, when Diane was spiraling into paranoia and letting her guard down. "I had to eliminate that journalist." Her voice was clear and unmistakable on the recording. "He was going to destroy everything I built, expose all the money I'd moved, and ruin my reputation in the community. I couldn't let that happen. And now this blogger is asking the same questions Kevin was asking. She has to be stopped permanently." When Emma heard those recordings from her home office, tears of relief streamed down her face. Finally, she whispered, proof that can't be disputed or explained away. After weeks of feeling helpless and victimized, she finally had the evidence that would bring Diane Blackwood to justice. The woman who had ordered her arm broken was about to face the consequences of underestimating a former prosecutor's determination. But Tommy wasn't satisfied with just having the evidence. He wanted Diane to incriminate herself publicly in a way that couldn't be covered up or swept under the rug by expensive lawyers and political connections. The plan he developed was elegant in its simplicity, use Max as bait to draw Diane into a final confrontation at the one place she couldn't afford to have disturbed, the Memorial Rose Garden, where Kevin Walsh's body was buried. Rico had been monitoring Diane's increasingly erratic behavior through her home security system, and it was clear that the psychological pressure was taking its toll. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating regularly, and was making increasingly desperate phone calls to various criminal contacts about cleanup services and permanent solutions. The woman who had once been the picture of suburban respectability was rapidly becoming a paranoid wreck. The trap was set when Max called Diane from an untraceable phone, his voice urgent with manufactured panic. "We have a serious problem," he told her. "The bikers know everything about the garden. They've been asking questions following paper trails, and they're getting close to finding him. We need to move the body before they dig it up." Diane's response was immediate and incriminating. How could they possibly know about Kevin? I was so careful." Tommy and Rico listened to the entire conversation through Max's wire, recording every word as Diane spiraled into full confession mode. She detailed how she'd killed Kevin Walsh when he got too close to exposing her embezzlement scheme, how she'd chosen the garden location because it was the last place anyone would think to look, and how she'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened to expose her crimes. The meeting was set for midnight at the Memorial Rose Garden, and Diane's final instruction to Max was chilling in its desperation. "If we can't move him tonight, then we'll have to make sure those bikers never get a chance to talk about what they think they know." It was a death threat, plain and simple, and it was exactly the evidence Tommy needed to justify what came next. As midnight approached, Rico positioned his equipment around the garden while Tommy's bikers took their positions in the shadows. Everything was being recorded in high definition and broadcast live to multiple secure servers, ensuring that whatever happened next would be preserved for posterity. Diane Blackwood was walking into the most important performance of her life, and she didn't even know she had an audience. Which betrayal would destroy Diane first? Max turning on her, or the truth literally buried beneath her feet? Midnight in a suburban memorial garden has this eerie quality that makes everything feel surreal, like you're watching a movie instead of living through real events. The moon was nearly full that night, casting long shadows through the carefully maintained flower beds and memorial plaques that Diane had used to hide her crimes. Rico had positioned cameras throughout the garden, and Tommy's bikers were hidden in positions that gave them clear sight lines while staying invisible to anyone approaching through the main entrance. When Diane arrived, she looked nothing like the composed HOA president who'd terrorized our neighborhood for years. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes wrinkled, and she kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected to be attacked at any moment. The psychological warfare campaign had taken its toll. This was a woman who was operating on pure desperation and very little sleep. She carried a shovel and a large duffel bag, suggesting she was prepared for some serious excavation work. Max was already waiting for her, near the center of the garden, right above the spot where Rico's ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies in the soil composition. "We need to work fast," Max told her, playing his role perfectly. "The bikers know everything about Kevin Walsh, and they're planning to bring authorities here tomorrow morning. If we're going to move him, it has to be tonight." Diane's response was immediate and incriminating. "How could they possibly know about Kevin? I buried him so deep, used lime to accelerate decomposition, even planted those rose bushes directly over the site." Rico was live streaming everything to secure servers while simultaneously recording through multiple camera angles, ensuring that every word and gesture was captured in pristine quality. 50,000 people were watching the stream in real time, though Diane had no idea she was performing for such a large audience. The chat was exploding with shock and outrage as viewers realized they were witnessing a murder confession in progress. "I never wanted to kill him," Diane continued, her voice breaking with stress and exhaustion. "Kevin was just supposed to be scared off like all the others." But he kept digging, kept asking questions, kept getting closer to the truth about where all that HOA money really went. When he showed up at my house that night, with documents proving I'd embezzled over $3.8 million, I knew I couldn't let him leave alive. The confession kept pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. Years of carefully maintained lies and cover-ups were collapsing under the pressure of paranoia and desperation. She described how she'd killed Kevin in a moment of panic, how she'd chosen the Memorial Garden location because it seemed poetic that a journalist would be buried under a monument to community values he'd tried to protect. That's when Tommy stepped out of the shadows, his massive frame seeming to materialize from the darkness like an avenging angel. "Actually, Diane," he said in that calm, controlled voice that somehow made him more terrifying than if he'd been shouting, "Kevin Walsh wasn't the only person you hurt. You also made the mistake of hurting our family." Rico emerged from behind another memorial plaque, his camera equipment visible, and obviously recording everything. The look on Diane's face when she realized she'd been trapped was something I'll never forget. Pure terror mixed with rage and disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend that her carefully crafted plans had been turned against her so completely. "You set me up," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Max nodded grimly and said, "It's over, Diane. Everyone heard you confess and there's no taking it back now." But Diane wasn't finished yet. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous, and she still had one card left to play. From her duffel bag, she pulled out something that made everyone freeze, a small pistol that she pointed directly at Max. "If I'm going down," she said with chilling determination, "I'm taking everyone with me who knows the truth, starting with you, you traitorous piece of garbage." The next few seconds felt like they lasted forever. Tommy was too far away to reach her before she could fire. Rico was exposed behind his camera equipment, and Max was standing directly in her line of fire with nowhere to run. But Diane had made one crucial mistake in her desperation. She'd forgotten that Tommy had been a detective long before he became a biker, and he'd never lost those tactical instincts that had kept him alive through years of dangerous situations. The flashbang grenade that Tommy threw landed right at Diane's feet, exploding with enough light and sound to disorient anyone within 20 feet. In the confusion that followed, three things happened almost simultaneously. Diane's shot went wild. Rico dove behind solid cover while still filming, and Tommy moved with the speed and precision of someone who'd trained for exactly this kind of situation his entire adult life. When the smoke cleared and everyone's hearing started returning to normal, Diane was on the ground with Tommy's knee in her back and zip-tie restraints around her wrists. The pistol had been kicked away and she was sobbing with the kind of broken, desperate tears that come from watching your entire life collapse in the space of a few minutes. "I'm sorry," she kept repeating, though it wasn't clear if she was apologizing for the murder, the embezzlement, or just for getting caught. The sound of police sirens was already approaching. Tommy had called them before the confrontation began, timing their arrival for maximum impact. Within minutes, the Memorial Garden was flooded with flashing lights and uniformed officers who'd been briefed on the situation and were prepared for what they'd find. Diane was officially arrested standing directly over Kevin Walsh's burial site with dozens of witnesses and thousands of recorded confessions as evidence. Emma arrived just as they were loading Diane into the police car, her arms still in a cast, but her eyes blazing with satisfaction. She positioned her wheelchair directly in Diane's path and looked her former tormentor straight in the eye. "You broke my arm to silence me," Emma said clearly enough for all the news cameras to record. "Instead, you made me famous, and now the whole world knows exactly what kind of monster hides behind suburban respectability." Diane's response was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I was just trying to protect myself, protect everything I'd built." Emma's reply was swift and merciless. "You should have thought about that before you hired fake HOA enforcement officers to attack innocent people." The crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch their former HOA president's downfall murmured their agreement, and I could see the satisfaction in their faces as justice was finally being served. As the police car pulled away with Diane inside, Rico announced to his live-stream audience that the feed had been viewed by over 100,000 people, with recordings automatically saved to multiple secure servers as evidence. Kevin Walsh's murder had been solved, Diane's embezzlement scheme had been exposed, and our community could finally begin the process of healing from years of corruption and abuse. But would Diane's arrest be enough to heal the wounds she'd torn through this community? Drop a comment from wherever you're watching and tell BD stories. Do you think Diane got what she deserved, or should the consequences have been even worse? 6 months later, I was sitting in a federal courthouse watching Diane Blackwood learn the true meaning of consequences. The woman who had once terrorized our neighborhood while hiding behind fake respectability was now wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, listening as the judge read out her sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole for premeditated murder, plus additional decades for embezzlement, assault, conspiracy, and fraud. The $8 million in restitution from her seized assets would be returned to all the communities she'd victimized over the years. The trial had been a media sensation, partly because of Rico's live stream footage that had captured everything in real time, but mostly because the case represented something larger than just one corrupt HOA president. Emma's blog coverage of the trial had turned her into a national voice for HOA reform, and her book, Fake HOA Officers: My Fight for Truth, had become a bestseller that was being optioned for a Netflix documentary series. Max Steele had kept his end of the bargain, providing testimony that sealed Diane's fate in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His recordings and evidence had been so comprehensive that Diane's expensive legal team had basically given up trying to claim innocence and focused instead on damage control. But there's only so much you can do when your client has been recorded confessing to murder in front of 50,000 live witnesses. Emma's arm had healed completely, and she was stronger than ever in every way that mattered. The attack that was supposed to silence her had instead launched her into a career as one of the country's most respected voices on consumer protection and community corruption. Her daily blog posts were reaching over 2 million readers, and she'd started a foundation that provided legal support for people fighting HOA abuse in their own communities. My own career had taken an interesting turn as well. After the publicity from Diane's case, I'd been promoted to senior construction engineer with a specialty in investigating municipal fraud. Apparently, there's a lot of demand for someone who can look at construction invoices and immediately spot when $3.8 million has been spent on flower beds that should have cost $10,000. Who knew that attention to detail could be so valuable? Tommy's Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club had undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. What started as an outlaw biker gang had evolved into something like unofficial community protectors working closely with local police on neighborhood safety initiatives. Tommy himself had been offered a job as a private investigator, though he had chosen to keep the club together while expanding their mission to include protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The community healing process had been remarkable to witness. Once Diane's crimes were exposed and the stolen money returned, our neighborhood had come together in ways I'd never seen before. The HOA was completely dissolved and replaced with a Democratic Residents Association, where every financial decision required transparent community approval. All those inflated fees were eliminated, and families suddenly found themselves with hundreds of extra dollars each month. The Memorial Rose Garden had been completely redesigned and renamed the Kevin Walsh Truth Garden with a memorial plaque that read, "In memory of Kevin Walsh, truth always surfaces." Kevin's remains had been properly recovered and buried with full honors, and his family had finally gotten the closure they'd been seeking for 18 months. The scholarship fund established in his name was already helping aspiring journalists who wanted to follow in his footsteps. Rico had parlayed his technical skills into a legitimate cybersecurity consulting business that specialized in helping communities detect financial fraud in their municipal organizations. Turns out there was huge demand for someone who could hack into HOA computer systems legally and expose corruption before it reached Diane Blackwood levels of criminality. He was making more money as a legitimate businessman than he had ever made through less legal activities. The ripple effects of our case had spread far beyond our little suburban community. Emma's coverage had inspired similar investigations in dozens of other cities, leading to the exposure of what federal authorities were calling the largest municipal corruption scheme in American history. Diane Haddon Blackwood wasn't just one corrupt HOA president. She was part of a network that had been systematically looting suburban communities for years. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Emma planted new flowers in the Kevin Walsh Truth Garden on the first anniversary of his body being discovered. The memorial service brought together hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Kevin's journalism or affected by Diane's crimes. Local police officers stood alongside Iron Wolves bikers, federal investigators, shared stories with neighborhood families, and everyone came together to celebrate the triumph of truth over corruption. Emma's speech that day captured everything we'd been through. Kevin Walsh died trying to expose the truth about corruption in our communities. Diane Blackwood thought she could bury that truth along with his body. But truth has a way of surfacing, especially when good people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Kevin's investigation didn't die with him. It lived on through everyone who demanded answers, who asked hard questions, and who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they were. The investigation had also revealed just how extensive Diane's criminal network had been. Federal authorities discovered she'd been running similar schemes in over 30 communities across 5 states, stealing millions of dollars through inflated construction contracts, fake improvement projects, and elaborate shell company arrangements. Dozens of other victims came forward with their own stories of intimidation, financial abuse, and suspicious deaths of people who'd asked too many questions. As I write this, Emma is working on her second book about the broader implications of municipal corruption while continuing to run her blog and foundation. Tommy's Club has officially partnered with law enforcement agencies in 3 states to provide community protection services. Rico's business is expanding rapidly as more communities recognize the need for independent financial monitoring of their municipal organizations. And Diane Blackwood, she's spending her life in federal prison, where I'm told she spends most of her time watching Emma's Netflix documentary about her own downfall. According to Emma's sources inside the prison system, Diane still maintains that she was just trying to protect herself and her community from outside threats. Even behind bars, she can't seem to accept responsibility for the lives she destroyed and the trust she betrayed. The final irony is that Diane's attempts to silence Emma through violence and intimidation had exactly the opposite effect. Emma's voice is now stronger and more influential than it ever would have been if Diane had simply answered her original questions about where $3.8 million had gone. Sometimes the cover-up really is worse than the crime, and sometimes trying to bury the truth just makes it grow stronger underground until it finally breaks through to the surface. Emma always ends her speaking engagements with the same message. Diane Blackwood learned the hardest lesson of all. When you attack someone's family, you don't just make enemies, you create legends. And legends never forget, never forgive, and never lose. Sometimes justice comes from courtrooms, sometimes it comes from the streets, but it always comes from people who refuse to let evil win. The final irony is that Diane's attempts to silence Emma through violence and intimidation had exactly the opposite effect. Emma's voice is now stronger and more influential than it ever would have been if Diane had simply answered her original questions about where $3.8 million had gone. Sometimes the cover-up really is worse than the crime, and sometimes trying to bury the truth just makes it grow stronger underground until it finally breaks through to the surface. Today, Emma continues fighting corruption through her blog and foundation. Tommy's Iron Wolves protect communities across multiple states, and Rico's cybersecurity business helps expose municipal fraud before it reaches dangerous levels. Diane Blackwood sits in federal prison watching Netflix documentaries about her own downfall, still unable to accept responsibility for the lives she destroyed.